Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about the contingencies of reinforcement and punishment. And I love this picture on the slide. It says, I'm sorry, it's not you. It's just that my behavior is lawful and shaped by environmental contingencies. So I think it reminds us of this behavior's perspective that we take, that the cause of our behavior lies in the environment. So for the video, our agenda, we're first going to talk about reinforcement. Then we're going to break it down and talk about positive and negative reinforcement. Then we're going to talk about the factors that affect reinforcement. Then switch over to punishment, talk about positive and negative punishment, the problems with punishment. And then I have a couple of practice questions for you guys so you can get used to identifying these reinforcement and punishment contingencies. And then we'll wrap it up with a summary. So here are your objectives for the video, and if you guys are following along in your task list, we are going to focus on C3 for this video. All right, so let's start with reinforcement. Now I'm going to give you guys a really technical, wordy definition of reinforcement. So here we go. Our definition is the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on a response increases the future probability of that response. Like I said, really detailed, really technical. So let's kind of break this down and go through it step by step. Okay, so the first part is that reinforcement is a process. It's not the reinforcing stimulus, which we call the reinforcer, or the act of reinforcing. It's actually this whole process by which the person engages in the behavior, and there's a stimulus change that's contingent on that behavior or response, and therefore that response is strengthened or increases in the future. So it's that whole process. When we talk about a stimulus change, we're talking about the presentation of something pleasant or the removal of something aversive. So that's what we mean by a stimulus change in the environment. Something gets presented or something gets removed. And that stimulus change is contingent on or reliably follows the response. So you guys will hear that word a lot. We talk about contingencies and things, and stimulus changes being contingent on a response. And that means, like I said, that stimulus change in the environment, whether that consequence of something getting presented or something removed, reliably follows the response. We talk about it in terms of being an if-then relationship. If this response occurs, then this happens in the environment. And remember that stimulus change in the environment, it rarely occurs at other times. So they're highly correlated in that stimulus change is only going to occur if the response has occurred. And here's your definition of the contingency as well. So the stimulus change is dependent on the response. So more likely to occur when the response has just occurred. All right, next part is the response. So remember that we reinforce behavior or responses, not persons. We often hear people say, oh, you need to reinforce Sarah, or you need to reinforce that person. And that's not really correct. You reinforce a behavior. So we're going to reinforce hand raising, or we're going to reinforce a correct vocalization, or things like that. And last, the key aspect of reinforcement is that it increases the future probability of the response. So the consequence, that stimulus change, that presentation or removal of the stimulus, affects the probability of similar behavior occurring again in the future. So the behavior is going to continue to occur due to that consequence or that stimulus change. So if you have a behavior that's continuing to occur, then there's some type of reinforcement contingency in effect. And so I wanted to make sure and drive this point home. We are always, with all these contingencies, we are always looking at the effects on behavior. So you guys are going to hear me say that lots of times throughout the course. You're always looking at the effects on behavior. So if the behavior doesn't increase, then it's not reinforcement. So if little Susie, raises her hand and you praise, but she doesn't raise her hand again, then that's not reinforcement. But if she raises her hand and you praise it, and the next day she comes in and raises her hand, then the future probability of the response is increased. It's continuing to occur, and therefore it actually was reinforcement. So keep that in mind. The behavior has to increase or continue to occur in the future for it to be referred to as reinforcement. Here's an example of reinforcement. So we have a little kiddo who tantrums at bedtime. So his parents put him in his room, they say goodnight, and then about 10 minutes later he's crying and screaming and things like that. So the consequence is that the parent comes in and gives the child attention. So they come in and they console the child and things like that. So if this just happens once, cool. But maybe tomorrow night or the next night when the child goes to bed and the parents say goodnight, if the child then tantrums at bedtime and the parents come in and give attention, then we have a reinforcement contingency. And so if the outcome is in the future, the child engages in tantruming behavior at bedtime to get attention, so now the behavior is reliably occurring, then that would be your reinforcement contingency, and that you have a stimulus change, which something got added in the environment, contingent on a response, that increases the future probability of the response. So the child is continuing to tantrum at bedtime, and therefore you have a reinforcement contingency. Okay, so let's break things down into positive and negative reinforcement. With positive reinforcement, you have the response, and the stimulus change is that something gets presented or something gets added in the environment. So kind of think of math, positive plus something gets added, and therefore the future probability of the response increases. So the response gets strengthened and it increases. So an example of positive reinforcement would be something like, say a kid is playing with other kids and he shares his toys, and you run over and you give him lots of praise and hugs and kisses and tell him how good of a job he's doing sharing. And then the next time he's in with a group of kids, he shares his toys. So our response, our behavior is sharing toys. The pleasant stimulus that is presented, so my praise and hugs and kisses got added, that was the consequence, and therefore the next time he got around with the kids, he shared his toys, so the response increased. So that would be an example of positive reinforcement. With negative reinforcement, what typically happens is there's something aversive that's in effect, the response occurs, and that aversive stimulus is removed. So negative, think about your math again, negative minus something gets removed. And that's that stimulus change, is that something aversive gets removed. That's where we get that negative from. And therefore, the response increases in the future. So an example of negative reinforcement would be, say you have a headache, so that's really aversive. Your response would be taking Advil. And when you take Advil, after about 20 minutes, the aversive stimulus is removed, so your headache goes away. And therefore, next time you have a headache, you are more likely to take Advil. So remember, your response is, or your behavior is taking Advil, and it's more likely to increase in the future when you have a headache because doing that behavior removes the headache. Let's see, I don't know if you guys ever press your snooze button. So in the morning, your alarm goes off, and you have this loud ringing in your ear that your alarm is going off. Super aversive. And so your response is hitting the snooze button. And when you hit the snooze button, the alarm sound goes away. That aversive stimulus is removed. And therefore, next time your alarm goes off again, you're more likely to hit the snooze button again to make it go away. I tend to have this problem as well. Sometimes I hit the snooze button probably 10 times. It's kind of a problem. So that would be an example of negative reinforcement. Sometimes with our kiddos in the clinic, they will oftentimes, something aversive is in effect, such as a demand that you place on them. And so they engage in a challenging behavior, hitting or biting or something like that. And maybe not in the clinic, but at home, the mom says, okay, fine, you don't have to do this. And that aversive stimulus or the demand gets removed. And therefore, the next time the mom places a demand on the child, they, if it's a negative reinforcement contingency, they might do that same biting or hitting. Mom removes the demand, and there's your negative reinforcement. So that's kind of more of a everyday applicable example. Now, with both of these, the similarities are that with both of these, a response occurs. The difference between them is that with positive reinforcement, remember the plus, something gets presented, so a pleasant stimulus gets presented, something gets added to the environment. Negative reinforcement, an aversive stimulus gets removed, so something gets removed from the environment. But both of these result in the future probability of the response increasing. So with both of these, your behavior is going to continue to occur. Okay, 3 steps to remember when you're pointing out whether something is reinforcement and more specifically positive or negative reinforcement. So you first want to pick out what's your behavior. If you're looking at a dog, is it them sitting? If you're looking at students, is it the students studying? If you're looking at soldiers, is it them running? If you're looking at babies, is it the baby waving? So what's the specific behavior that you're looking at? And then you want to look at what's the desired change in the behavior as a result of the consequences. So what's happening in the future to the behavior? If it's increasing, if it's continuing to happen, then it's reinforcement. If it's decreasing, it's something else, which we'll get to. So if our behavior is increasing, we know it's reinforcement. And then we have to figure out, is the nature of the stimulus, so is the consequence, or is the nature of that stimulus change, so the consequence in the environment, is something getting added or removed? If something is getting added, and with reinforcement, something pleasant gets added, then it's positive reinforcement. If something gets taken away, so an aversive stimulus gets taken away, then it's negative reinforcement. All right, guys, so let's talk a little bit more about negative reinforcement. So within negative reinforcement, we have what we call escape behavior and avoidance behavior. And I wanted to give you guys kind of a basic example of both of these so that you can really grasp the concept between the two. So say we have a rat and a Skinner box. And the rat's over here on this grid, and he sees a light, and then he gets a little mild shock. The rat can jump across this barrier here and basically escape the shock. So if an aversive, he basically gets a warning signal, he gets a shock, and he can jump over the little ledge to escape the shock or terminate the shock. So when we look at this, we have our shock, and our response is crossing the barrier, which results in the removal of the shock. So once again, negative reinforcement. Next time the rat feels a little shock, he's going to jump over the barrier and removes the shock. And this is what we refer to as escape. So escape means when the behavior terminates the aversive stimulus. So the aversive stimulus is actually an effect, and you engage in the behavior to escape or terminate the aversive stimulus. Avoidance is a little different. So with avoidance, you have the same scenario with the rat in the Skinner box, and he gets a little warning signal, so a little light, or a little siren, and the rat actually jumps over the barrier before the shock. And so he actually learns to avoid the shock. So basically with this one, you have the light, and in response to the light, the rat crosses the barrier and avoids the shock. So with avoidance, avoidance is classified as when the behavior prevents the aversive stimulus from even occurring. So the difference between these two is that with escape, the aversive stimulus is already in effect, so the behavior is going to terminate it. But with avoidance, you're going to engage in the behavior before the aversive stimulus is even presented, and it's going to prevent the aversive stimulus. All right, so here are some factors that affect reinforcement. And the first one is that you want to give the reinforcer immediately or as soon as possible after the behavior occurs, because you want that relationship between the behavior and the reinforcer, which is that contingent relationship. So you want to make sure that once the appropriate behavior occurs, that you're providing that reinforcer. If you wait too late, there's a chance that the child or the learner could be engaging in other behaviors, and you might reinforce a behavior that you didn't mean to reinforce. So right after that behavior occurs, you provide that reinforcer, and that's the immediacy, and that also provides that contingent relationship that if I engage in this behavior, then I get this. It makes that contingent relationship really easy to learn for the learner. Individual differences also affect reinforcement. So there are different things that people find pleasant and aversive, and so you have to figure that out for each one of your clients. For instance, I love M&Ms, I love chocolate and chocolate ice cream, but if you present me with candy, like sugary candy such as Skittles or something like that, I don't really care to work for those. It doesn't bother me. So, or that's not something that I'm kind of motivated for. So there are individual differences in what is reinforcing for each person. You have to make sure that the reinforcement is large enough. So you have to provide a large enough reinforcer that they actually want the reinforcer. If you're reinforcing with M&Ms and you break it down, some people break their M&Ms into like little pieces, and you just give the learner a little piece that might not be large enough. And some clinics do that, and if that works, then that's definitely awesome. But you want to make sure that your reinforcer is large enough to fit the behavior that the learner is engaging in. And the last one is what we call motivating operations, which we'll talk about also further on in the course. But motivating operations is that the person has to want the item. So there has to be some type of deprivation for the item, essentially. And so, for example, so time of day matters. For example, right before lunch, edibles are really reinforcing because there's a deprivation for food and your client is typically hungry. So that would be a good time to use edibles as a reinforcer. After lunch, there's what we call an abolishing operation. So there's a satiation for food. So after lunch, edibles might not be as reinforcing. They might not want the edibles because there's not a deprivation for them. And so figuring out what your kids want at different times of the day can be a challenge when you guys work as RBTs. All right, so let's switch gears to punishment. Punishment, I'm going to give you guys a similar definition as reinforcement, except for this time, this whole process by which a stimulus change is contingent on a response decreases the future probability of that response. Remember, with reinforcement, it's going to increase the future probability. Punishment is going to decrease the future probability. Once again, similar aspect to reinforcement, and that punishment is the process. After the response, there's a stimulus change. So that means that something gets added in the environment or removed. So presentation or removal of a stimulus. That stimulus change is contingent on, reliably follows the response. And remember, we punish behavior, not persons. And then, like I said, key aspect of punishment is going to, the stimulus change is going to decrease the future probability of the response. So once again, similar to reinforcement, remember that if the behavior does not decrease, then it's not punishment. So remember, we're always looking at the effects on behavior. After the stimulus change, what's the effect on the behavior? Is the behavior increasing? Then it's reinforcement. Is the behavior decreasing? If it is, then it's punishment. Or something else, which we call extinction. But for the purposes of this video, it's punishment. So keep that in mind. We're looking at the effects on behavior. Once again, similar to reinforcement, we have positive punishment and negative punishment. With positive punishment, a response occurs and a aversive stimulus is presented, which results in the future probability of the response decreasing. Negative punishment, there's something pleasant in effect. The response occurs, the pleasant stimulus is removed, and the future probability of the response decreases. If you guys have ever talked back to your parents, so you have your cell phone, you talk back to your parents take your cell phone away, and therefore you don't talk back to your parents anymore. That would be an example of negative punishment. Similar to reinforcement, so punishment, a response occurs. Here is your classifying this as positive or negative. So something is added to the environment, an aversive stimulus is presented, that's where you get the positive, and something is removed, remember the minus negative sign, that's where you get the negative punishment when a pleasant stimulus is removed. And both of these decrease the future probability of the response. So once again, let's go back to our 3 steps. Determine the behavior. What behavior are you focusing on? What's the desired change as a result of the consequence? So after the consequence occurs, what's the effect on the behavior? If it's increasing, it's reinforcement. If it's decreasing, it's punishment. And then what was the consequence? Did something get added or removed? If something got added, so an aversive stimulus got added, then it's positive punishment. If something positive got or pleasant got taken away, then it is negative punishment. So a couple of things about punishment, and then we're going to practice identifying some reinforcement and punishment contingencies. Keep in mind with punishment that there is an everyday definition of punishment, and then there's a technical definition that we use in behavior analysis. So basically, your everyday definition of punishment has a really negative connotation. You say punishment and people just automatically think that you are harming the kid, and that's not the case. Remember, our technical definition describes a process by which there's a behavior which is reliably follows, there's a stimulus change, whether presentation or removal of a stimulus reliably follows a response, and therefore the future probability of that response decreases. One other thing, when we're talking about, we're talking about aversive or even pleasant in a way, we are, once again, always looking at the effects on behavior. So when we say aversive, that doesn't equal painful. We say, what we mean with aversive is that whenever this item gets presented, it's going to decrease the behavior. And same with pleasant. Whenever we say pleasant, we mean that whenever this item is going to get presented, it's going to increase behavior, and when it gets removed, it's going to decrease behavior. So it doesn't mean that, aversive doesn't necessarily mean painful. It just means that it's going to decrease the behavior if it gets presented, or increase it if it gets removed. So keep that in mind. We're always looking at the effects on behavior. But, with regards to these two things, if you start talking, especially to your parents of your kids, if you're working as an RBT, and you keep talking about an aversive stimulus or using punishment, which hopefully you aren't using at all, in your clinic. So we'll talk about that in a second. But if you do say that to parents, they automatically don't understand that that you're talking about it in a way of it being a very technical definition. They automatically kind of shut down and think that you're going to harm their kid and things like that. So these are very kind of thin lines that you have to walk on when you, if your clinic and if your BCBA decides that they are going to use punishment. So keep that in mind. Punishment contingencies are actually really common. We experience them all the time in the everyday world. We open a door and we slam our finger, and therefore we don't open the door that way in the future. Things like that. Or, we make a joke and our friends kind of give us this aversive stare, and so we don't tell that joke again. This happens all the time in the everyday world. But what I wanted to point out is when you're programming it deliberately into treatment by a professional, it could be a little different. So although this happens in the everyday world and we get exposed to punishment contingencies all the time, specifically putting them in a treatment program is different. And so if your BCBA is going to put a punishment procedure into a treatment program, then really we advocate that it's the very last resort. You tried all of your reinforcement techniques, and that you definitely let the parents know, you let them know what you're doing, and they have to agree to it. So all those things have to take effect before you actually implement a punishment procedure into treatment. And I have this video for you guys to watch on your module. I like it. It really talks about the different definitions of punishment and how we view punishment in behavior analysis, and how the everyday parent views punishment, and how you really have to be careful of the words that you use when you're talking to to parents, as opposed to talking to other RBTs or talking to your BCBA. And this is one thing that we're going to talk about because it's actually in your ethics code. You are ethically required to explain your procedures to parents in a way that they can understand. So whatever technical language that you use with other RBTs and your BCBA, you're not going to use that with parents because they're probably not going to understand and they're not going to know what you're doing. So you have an ethical responsibility to explain these terms in a way that they understand and they know what you're doing. And so these terms that you use that might be technical to us and not have a negative connotation, just being aware that they might really offend the parents that you're working with and things like that. Oh,
It's worth seeing.
All right, so you guys can watch that. All right, one reason that punishment should be your last resort, Skinner always advocated to make sure you go through all your reinforcement contingencies before you use punishment. Hopefully you get in a clinic that does not use punishment or uses it as a very, very, very last resort if they need to. But we don't use punishment because there are some side effects to punishment. First of all, it doesn't directly strengthen adaptive behavior. So you are decreasing a behavior, but you need to actually increase an adaptive behavior. So if you're going to use punishment, you need to use some type of, you need to teach an appropriate behavior so that the person knows how to respond appropriately. If you punish one behavior, it can actually result in suppression of other behaviors. And those behaviors might be really appropriate adaptive behaviors that you want to increase, but it just gets, it kind of generalizes from the punishment procedure that you implemented with one behavior. The person delivering the punishment could become a signal for punishment. And so what typically will happen if they become a signal for punishment, the person might try and escape that person or run away from them. I don't know if you guys have ever had teachers when you're growing up that just always got on to you and always reprimanded you, and you might walk down the hall and see them at the end of the hall and you're going to go the other way. It's because they are, for you, a signal of punishment, so you're going to try to avoid them. And you get that unwanted behavior suppressed only when that person is present. So you'll start to see some differentiation between the context, and that the learner won't engage in the challenging behavior or whatever behavior they've gotten punished for in the presence of the specific person that's delivering the punishment, but they will do it in other contexts or around other people. So it kind of becomes context dependent. Punishment can also teach the individual to avoid the person who delivered the punishment, which I just talked about in the third one. It's likely to elicit a strong emotional response. So you are likely to get some emotional responding and some aggression as well when you implement extinction. So that kind of falls along with this one as well. And then with number 7, punishment through modeling could teach a person that punishment is an acceptable means of controlling behavior. So, I go back to Bandura's studies on observational learning with the Bobo doll. If you implement punishment, you are essentially the model, and that child or that learner might very likely go on and imitate that punishment or implement that punishment procedure with another person or just in general. So it kind of teaches them that that's the way to control behavior, and that's not really appropriate. And then finally, punishment is very effective, which is why oftentimes punishment is used very regularly in the school system, with parenting and everything like that, in the workforce as well. And that's because it has immediate effect on stopping the unwanted behavior. It's very effective, especially, and with punishment, you also want to implement it immediately. So when the behavior occurs, you want to implement that punishment immediately. Like I said, very effective. It will immediately stop the unwanted behavior. But because it's so effective, it often becomes reinforcing to the person that is implementing the punishment. And oftentimes, the more that they do it, the more intense the punishment gets, and it can be a slippery slope downhill. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's go through some practice, and let's try and pick out our reinforcement contingencies and punishment contingencies. So first of all, the scenario: a child starts screaming in a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again, and the parent offers ice cream. So remember our 3 steps. First step is picking out the behavior. So what is the child's behavior? And if you want to pause the video and try to answer on your own, then that's awesome. But the behavior is that the child is screaming. Is it increasing or decreasing? Well, we know that when they go to the store again, the child screams again. So we would say that the behavior is increasing. So we know that this is reinforcement. So now we got to figure out, is this positive or negative reinforcement? So after the behavior occurs, after the child screams, does something pleasant get added, or does something aversive get removed? And after the child screams, they get to go for ice cream. So something positive is being added. So this would be positive reinforcement. All right, so let's look at part 2. A child starts screaming in a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again and the parent offers ice cream. So now let's look at it from the parent's perspective, because the contingency can be different. So what's the parent's behavior? The parent's behavior is offering ice cream. Is it increasing or decreasing? Well, we know that when they go to the store again, the child screams, the parent once again offers ice cream. It's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. And is something being added or removed? And after the parent offers ice cream, the child stops screaming. So that aversive stimulus has been removed. So from the parent's perspective, this is negative reinforcement. All right, Johnny has been crying during school. His parents decide that they're not going to let him watch TV when he gets home if he cries in school that day. Johnny no longer cries in school. So first of all, let's pick out Johnny's behavior. It's crying during school. So is it increasing or decreasing? So we know that Johnny was crying and he no longer cries in school, so it's decreasing. So we know this is punishment. So now let's figure out, after Johnny cries, is something aversive being added or something pleasant being removed? And we see that after he cries, he doesn't get to watch TV when he gets home. So something pleasant gets removed. So this would be negative punishment. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. First, pick out your behavior. Remember, we're always looking at the effects on behavior and looking at what's going on in the environment. So what's your behavior? Is it increasing or decreasing? Increasing, it means reinforcement. Decreasing, for the purposes of this video, it'll mean punishment. And then you're going to look at, after the behavior occurs, what's happening with the consequence? Is something being added or removed? If something's being added, it's positive. If something's being removed, it's negative. Okay, so a little more practice. First one, Darren curses at his teacher when she asks him to do his math problems. The teacher sends him to sit at the back of the room by himself for 15 minutes, and thus he gets out of doing his math problems. When he curses at her, he continues to curse at her when she tells him to do his math problems. So we have Darren, and his behavior is cursing at the teacher, or cursing. And is it increasing or decreasing? So we know that he's continuing to curse at her, so it's increasing. So we have a reinforcement contingency. So now we have to figure out, is this positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? After he curses, we need to figure out what happens. Does something get added or removed? And he gets to sit at the back of the room by himself, and he gets out of doing his math problems. So something aversive got removed. So this is negative reinforcement. Number 2, Maxine has a bad rash. Whenever she scratches it, the itching goes away for a while. Therefore, Maxine continues to scratch her arm when it itches. So pick out our behavior. It's scratching. Is it increasing or decreasing? So it tells us that she's continuing to scratch her arm when it itches. So it's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. And now we have to figure out, is it positive or negative reinforcement? So after she itches, what happens with the consequence? Does something get added or removed? And we see that the itching goes, the itching goes away for a while. So an aversive stimulus gets removed, so that would make it negative reinforcement. All right, and let's look at this. So negative reinforcement, remember we talked about escape or avoidance. So think about whether this would be escape behavior or avoidance behavior. And her arm starts to itch, starts to itch, so she scratches it and it removes the itch. So this would be an example of escape behavior because it is already starting to itch and her scratching terminates the itching. Okay, let's see. Number 3, a woman waiting for her bus opens her umbrella when it rains. The umbrella keeps the rain from hitting her. Now she always opens her umbrella when it rains. Okay, so our behavior is opening the umbrella. She is it increasing or decreasing? And it says that she always opens her umbrella, so we know that it's increasing. It's continuing to occur, so we know it's reinforcement. So you have to figure out, is it positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? And we know, so after she opens her umbrella, does it remove something aversive or present something positive or pleasant? And we see that it removes the rain. So it removes something aversive. And so that would be negative reinforcement. And so let's look at whether it's escape or avoidance. So this one is a little vague, so I'm going to clarify a little more. What if she walks out in the rain and it hits her, and then she puts the umbrella up? That would be an example of escape. So the aversive stimulus was in effect, it was raining on her, she put the umbrella up, and it was escape. Now, what if before she goes out into the rain, she puts the umbrella up, and the rain doesn't actually hit her? That would be an example of avoidance, because she was avoiding the aversive stimulus. So that's the difference between that escape and avoidance. All right, number 4, you stick your hand in a flame and you get a painful burn. You'll never do that again. So behavior, sticking your hand in the flame. Is it increasing or decreasing? And you'll never do that again, so it's decreasing. So we know this is punishment. And after you stick your hand in a flame, what happens? Does something aversive get presented or something you like pleasant get removed? And we see that you get a painful burn, so something aversive gets presented. So this would be positive punishment. And then the last one, Bobby fights with his sister and does not get to watch TV that night. Now he does not fight with his sister anymore. So we got behavior is Bobby fighting. Is it increasing or decreasing? So we know that he doesn't fight with his sister anymore. So it's decreasing, so we know it's punishment. And now we look at the consequence. So after he fights with his sister, does something aversive get presented, or does something pleasant get removed? And we see that he doesn't get to watch TV that night. So something pleasant gets removed. So this would be an example of negative punishment. So, all right, guys, good job. So we talked about our very big technical definition of reinforcement. We talked about positive and negative reinforcement. Remember, the difference between positive and negative. Positive is that after the behavior occurs, something pleasant gets presented. Negative, something aversive gets removed. Remember, think about it in math. Positive means something gets added. Negative means something gets removed. But both of these are reinforcement, so they both increase the future probability of the response. Remember, it's all about the effects on behavior. Within negative reinforcement, we talked about escape and avoidance learning. And then we talked about some factors for applying reinforcement. We talked about definition of punishment, very similar to reinforcement, except the future probability of the behavior decreases. We also talked about positive and negative punishment. Once again, positive punishment means after the behavior occurs, something gets added. Negative means something gets removed. With punishment, something aversive gets added, whereas negative, something unpleasant gets removed. But once again, they're both punishment, so both of these decrease the future probability of the response. We talked about differences in everyday punishment and in ABA. Some problems with punishment. Remember, punishment should always be your last resort just because there are so many side effects. It is effective, but last resort. And then we did some practice problems. So, all right, guys, please let me know if you have any questions as you're going through this video, and thanks for listening.